Last week, in introducing the Gospel of Luke, just took note of some of the individuals that Jesus encountered and those particular encounters that are unique to Luke's Gospel. For example, even the most familiar parable, the parable of the Good Samaritan in Luke chapter 10, that is definitely unique to Luke's Gospel. But our theme being a place for you as we spend some time in Luke's Gospel over these next several weeks. So as you look back on the summer of 2023, that seems like it's in the past now. It's in the distance. The summer of 2023, the students have been back in school for a couple of weeks now. We're back in the swing of things. This is officially fall, even though it's 120,000 degrees outside. You know, this really is the beginning of the school year. So what stands out to you? What unique event stands out as you look back on the summer of 2023? I know particular summers have specific events that stand out. Like, for example, I remember the summer of 1978 very specifically because I got my driver's license that summer. That's a life-changing experience. But for me, we spent some time in 1 John, and one thing that really stands out to me, one passage, one verse continues to stand out and speak to me. And that's 1 John chapter 2, especially verse 6. This is how we know we are in Him. Whoever claims to live in Him must walk as Jesus did. The morning I preached on this text, I made the comment, this particular passage, especially verse 6, has always felt overwhelming to me. How can we possibly live in Him? How can we possibly walk as Jesus did? And so as I stood back and reflected on that passage over the course of the summer of 2023, I realized that's what our calling is. Our calling is to walk as Jesus did. So I really think as we invest time in the Gospel of Luke, not only in our Sunday morning experience together, but as you read on your own, I really think that Luke's Gospel can direct such a walk. To walk as he did. We most certainly need some direction and some guidance, if you will. I believe that Luke's Gospel will provide us such direction. So this morning, Luke chapter 5, verses 12 through 15. I want to do something a little interesting this morning. I want to read the passage one time, and then I'm going to read it a second time with a very specific reflection or specific assignment. So just sit back and enjoy for this first reading, Luke 5, 12 through 15. In Luke chapter 5, he says this. While Jesus was in one of the towns, a man came along who was covered with leprosy. When he saw Jesus, he fell with his face to the ground and begged him, Lord, if you are willing, you can make me clean. Jesus reached out his hand and touched the man. I am willing, he said. Be clean. And immediately the leprosy left him. Then Jesus ordered him, don't tell anyone, but go show yourself to the priest and offer the sacrifices that Moses commanded for your cleansing as a testimony to them. Yet the news about him spread all the more so that the crowds of people came to hear him and to be healed of their sicknesses. And in the passage I made reference to and call to worship this morning in verse 16, but Jesus often withdrew to lonely places and prayed. In just a moment, I want to read it a second time, but here's what I'd like to do. I'd like for you to imagine you are in that town at that very moment. You're not only in that town, but you're in close enough proximity that you can see the interchange that takes place with Jesus and this man who was covered with leprosy. The disease had reached its peak in his life. And you're close enough in proximity as well that you can actually hear the interchange between Jesus and this man who is covered with leprosy. So imagine yourself, visualize in your mind. You are standing right there. You are literally observing everything that's taking place. So I'll read the text again. You're there. And as I read this text, what are you thinking? What's going through your mind as you observe this happening, as you hear what Jesus says, you hear what the leper has to say to Jesus? What are you thinking? What is your response? And even more particularly, what does it do to your heart? As you see these events unfold, what does that do to your heart? You're right there. You are an eyewitness. What are you thinking? I'll read it again. What are you thinking? You're in that town at that moment. While Jesus is in one of the towns, a man came along who was covered with leprosy. When he saw Jesus, he fell with his face to the ground and begged him, "Lord, if you are willing, you can make me clean." Jesus reached out his hand and touched the man. "I am willing," he said. "Be clean." And immediately the leprosy left him. Then Jesus ordered him, "Don't tell anyone, but go show yourself to the priest and offer the sacrifices that Moses commanded for your cleansing as a testimony to them." Yet the news spread about him all the more, and the crowds of people came to hear him and to be healed of their sicknesses. You are there at that moment. And so, because you're there, and because you're living in your town, living in that time period, if you can imagine that as well, you absolutely know the consequences of living with leprosy. I'm not sure any of us in this room actually comprehend the consequences of living with leprosy and what that meant for them in that time period and that culture. So let me give you a little background, and that might enhance your visualization if I can give you just a little bit of background on what it was like to live with leprosy and how they had to interact socially. So here's what one writer says. In Israel, the lot of a leper was summed up in Leviticus chapter 13, 45 and 46. The leprous person who has a disease shall wear torn clothes and let his hair have his head hang loose. He shall cover his upper lip and cry out, "Unclean, unclean." He shall remain unclean as long as he has the disease. He is unclean, he shall live alone. His dwelling shall be outside the camp. We can hardly imagine the humiliation and isolation of a leper's life. He was ostracized from society because it was thought at the time that leprosy was highly contagious. Moreover, for the sake of the ritual purity of the community, whenever he came in range of the normal population, he had to assume a disheveled appearance and cry, "Unclean, unclean." Think about how you would feel shouting this while entering a grocery store or a mall, and the pervasive sense of worthlessness and despair you would experience. Lepers were typically beggars because there was no way they could support themselves. Sometimes their families deposited food in remote places. They customarily lived in bands with their fellow outcasts. By Jesus' time, rabbinical teaching with its minute strictures had made matters even worse. If a leper even stuck his head inside a house, the house was pronounced unclean. It was illegal to greet a leper. Lepers had to remain at least 100 cubits away if they were upwind and 4 cubits if downwind. Josephus, the Jewish historian, summed it up by saying, lepers were treated as if they were in effect dead men walking. So as you visualize being in that town at that moment, perhaps now you have at least somewhat of a better appreciation for what it was like socially to experience leprosy. And then, because you're so close, because you can see, because you can hear, you watch Jesus do the unthinkable. because Jesus actually reaches out and touches this man. As one person said, Jesus touches him, showing the tender touch of compassion and acceptance to a man who could not be touched by others. It was unheard of. It was completely uncharacteristic for someone to reach out and put their hand on a leper. He touched him. There's no telling how long it had been since this man had experienced basic, fundamental human touch. And Jesus reaches out with that touch of compassion. So again, you're there. You're there within earshot. You're in that town at that moment. And you're very aware of the isolation this man has experienced as a consequence of the leprosy. And you quickly recognize his desperation. As I read this narrative over the course of this past week, I tried to formulate a word. What is a descriptive word that really portrays effectively what this whole story is describing? And that's the word I came up with. Desperation. This individual is completely and totally desperate. And so you hear Jesus say to him when the leper comes, say, if you're willing. The leprous man says, if you're willing, you can make me clean. And Jesus' response, I am willing. And at the same time, not only is there verbal communication directed to the leper, but there's a nonverbal communication of touching him. I am willing. And because you're there, you hear Jesus say it, and you're a little bit blown away. You're surprised, to say at the very least, at watching Jesus touch this man and to hear him say, I am willing. So if you're there, if you're in this town at this moment, you're never going to be the same. Can you think of life experiences that you've had, and you look back on those particular life experiences and you think, after that, I'm never going to be the same. And I think we can think of such experiences in very positive terms, and we can also think of such experiences in really discouraging and negative terms as well. But if you observe Jesus telling this man, I am willing, and touching him, your life is changed, and it is changed forever. You'll never be the same. Because if Jesus was willing to receive this man, then that means he is also willing to embrace your needs too. To Jesus, who says, I am willing, to this man who is dealing with leprosy, he is willing to embrace your needs as well. Jesus most certainly is not aloof or uncaring or lacking in compassion. I think we need periodic reminders. Sometimes we have this really warped perception of the very identity of Jesus. Jesus is not aloof, uncaring, or lacking in compassion. Now, sometimes at my house, I'm told that my red wires and my red wires aren't connected, and my black wires and black wires aren't connected. Sometimes I'm told your red wires and your black wires are arcing inside your brain. And so sometimes I make connections that nobody else sees. So I made a connection on this passage that probably nobody else is going to see, but I'm going to share it anyhow. I couldn't help but make the connection that Jesus conveying to this man with leprosy that he was willing to this passage in Hebrews 4, 15 through 16. So the Hebrews writer says, for we do not have a high priest who is unable to sympathize with our weaknesses, but we have one who has been tempted in every way just as we are, yet did not sin. Let us then approach God's throne of grace with confidence so that we may receive mercy and find grace to help us in our time of need. Just the very character of Jesus. And I realize not necessarily comparing apples and apples in terms of the man with leprosy versus what's being communicated in Hebrews 4, but the principle is important, and that's why I made that connection this week, that we can approach the throne of grace with confidence to receive mercy and grace in our time of need, regardless of what those needs happen to be. So after being in that town at that moment, you'll never view people in need the same. So let's think about that for just a moment. What are the people around you facing? And I wish that I'd used a different phrase now. When I say the people around you, I'm thinking people you're close to, people that you associate with on a very regular basis, your family, your friends. What are people around you? When they're around you, they're close. They're close in proximity. What are they facing? What are they dealing with? And what is your reaction to them? Are they finding that so many are unwilling? Are the people around them unwilling? And so as you observe, you're in that town at that moment, so it's rocked your world. You're never going to be the same, and so you're going to view people's needs very, very differently. And you're going to be reminded Jesus is not aloof, uncaring, or lacking in compassion, and you are not either. Is that correct? As you were there, you were in that town at that moment, you were there. And so he's not lacking in compassion, and you are not either. To say you are willing is to walk as Jesus did. Back to 1 John chapter 2, verse 6. Our expectation is to walk as Jesus did. And to convey to a person, whether we actually choose to use that language or not, maybe we use some other form of language, but to say to some person, in essence, I am willing. I don't know what you're facing, but I am willing because I want to emulate the very character of Jesus. Okay, y'all time me. How did I do? I think it may be just a little over 10, but I got pretty close. We're going to stand in a moment and sing an invitation song. A couple of reasons. I want to ask a couple of things. I want to ask you. Are you willing? As you consider the needs of those around you, are you willing? And secondly, how will Luke, the material that you have observed in the Gospel of Luke, how will that direct your walk this week? So for those of you, this is your first Sunday with us, we do the invitation in a little unique manner here at the Grayberry Church of Christ. One of the shepherds will join me down front. We do a traditional invitation in that regard. But additionally, we also have two of our shepherds who will be in this classroom off to my far right at the very back. It's a little more of a private setting. If you would like to seek out one of our elders who could pray with you, or something that is more of a personal nature that you'd like to share, you maybe just need a good word of encouragement. They're very supportive, obviously very encouraging too. I would invite you to take full advantage of either one of these opportunities during our invitation song this morning. Let's stand and sing.